Our guest speaker is a young man with a varied and exciting background. His name is Bob Larson. As an all-A full scholarship student, Bob worked his way through college with his own rock and roll band. His performances have taken him from recording studios to national television shows, including an appearance in Atlantic City's huge convention hall. He also worked as a disc jockey and composed over 100 rock songs. Mr. Larson has written several books, and his lectures have taken him to 15 foreign countries. Today's presentation will deal with the music and message of America's rock culture. Let us welcome Mr. Bob Larson.
It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I always count it a privilege whenever I have the chance to stand before a group of students in a program like this, because this is an important age when you're obviously making a lot of decisions about the future. As a young teenager in school, I recall that I'd unfortunately made some wrong decisions to turn my back on most everything my church, school, and parents had tried to teach me, and laugh like I want to live it, and I could care less what anybody else thinks. Well, it wasn't until my early 20s that I came to the decision, if I was going to get what I wanted out of life, I was going to have to change that kind of an attitude. I've since become concerned about the attitudes of young people and the way in which they're influenced with music today. And I'd like to talk with you about this for a few moments and hope that together we can consider some important issues. Now, on the pop music scene today, there's a wide variety of music. Today, hard rock in the top 40 category only comprises about 30 to 40% of the market. But 90% of all records in America that are sold are not singles. They're LPs, albums. And the majority of albums today are still in the hard rock category. And that style of music is an extremely powerful influence. Perhaps I could illustrate it like this. For example, I might be able to walk out here today, deliver a speech, maybe mocking the flag or ridiculing some leaders in our government, and I suppose there's some of you wouldn't say anything. Or maybe I could come out here and curse God, or maybe use some four-letter words, and that might not get some of you too uptight. But there's one thing I'm pretty sure of. If I walked out here this morning and said one word against Rolling Stones, Stewart and the Faces, or Grand Funk, Black Sabbath, Santana, and maybe even Alice Cooper, there probably would be some of you who'd want to come up here and tear me from limb to limb. The question that I'd like to pose to you today is this. Would a reaction like that be right, or perhaps would that illustrate that really this thing called rock is something a lot more than merely a form of music? what is the music called rock that is sweeping the world off of its feet and probably deafening the ears of some of you teachers? I'm very specific today. I'm not here, really, to talk about all popular music, but a certain kind, because of the instruments or the musical arrangement or the lyrical content can categorically be defined as hard rock. Now, when I say instrument, I'm sure most of you think of the guitar, which has been the basic instrument. The first groups had the lead, rhythm, bass, drums. Later on, they added other instruments, saxophones, pianos, even string sections. But basically, rock has kept what's called the small combo sound. Now, it's not like, back when some of your parents wanted to dance, they had to go out and hire at least a 30 or 40-piece orchestra, which, could get kind of expensive. Today, 4 young men with 3 chords and guitar get together and can play a danceable rhythm. In fact, they estimate that just in America alone, today there are literally over 100,000 rock bands performing professionally. Now, a moment ago, I used the term musical arrangement. By this, I meant that rhythmically, you really can make most any song rock if you use one of 2 basic rhythmic techniques, syncopation or pulsation. Now, pulsation is that steady, heavy, driving sound in rock. What you do is to over-electronically accentuate it. When it was first introduced, back in the early 60s, it sounded basically something like this. Last few years, though, there's been a trend to slow that down because a song doesn't have to be fast to be rock, and in fact, you can have a much slower tempo. But if you still have that same basic driving pulsation, even on a much slower tempo, you can still get the basic feel of rock. Technique that I mentioned a moment ago is syncopation. And musically, this means in the song, you place the accent on the off beat. If you do that, it then gives you an effect like this. Just going to sit down and write the words to one of today's rock songs, you'd have a lot of subjects you could choose from. You might write one of today's rock songs about love. Of course, now it would be different. It wouldn't be the kind of love. Well, it wouldn't be like love in the old days when Mr. Marcus was around. Way back then. And, back in the days when Mr. Marcus was singing about love. Those days was a lot different because, then, love to them was something more like crooning a tune in the month of June under the moon. But today, boy, it sure isn't like that anymore. And I'm really quite serious. Unfortunately, today, it's more likely to be Come On Baby Light My Fire, or the Rolling Stones singing Let's Spend the Night Together, or maybe even a little bubblegum with jam up and jelly tight. You won't say you will, but there's a chance that you might. Or they call it puppy love. Knock 3 times on the ceiling if you want me. Or rap, rap, rap. He's a rapper, you know what he's after. Or Rod Stewart and Faces singing. Maggie, mother, what a lover, you wore me out. All you did was wreck my... Or... I got a brand new pair of roller skates. You got a brand new key. Or loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right. Or T-Rex and bang a gong, get it on. Or the Raspberries singing, please go all the way. Or the Rolling Stones from their album Exile on Main Street, singing I Gave You Diamonds, You Gave Me Disease. Or we could take some other examples, some groups who... some groups who've had not only a rather promiscuous and obscene view of love. Why, in the last couple of years, even religion has been getting into the act. We've learned that supposedly Jesus is a soul man and that God is a spirit in the sky. Speaking of religion, of course, the biggest selling single record of the year in 1971 was George Harrison's My Sweet Lord. I had a lot of teenagers ask me if the song was a statement of Christian faith. Not hardly. George Harrison's been a Hindu for 5 years, and the Lord in the song is Lord Krishna, one of the Hindu gods. That's why at the end of the song they sing the ugly Krishna Hindu prayer chant. Speaking of religion, of course, there was the album that earned nearly $13 million for Santana called Abraxas. I won't talk about the picture of the 2 ladies in the front, but the title, Abraxas, is actually taken from witchcraft and refers to the casting of an evil spell. Of course, on Broadway now, we've got Godspell. That's the play where Jesus comes on the stage in a Superman sweatshirt, a Valentine painting on his forehead, and a red rose over his heart. Speaking of religion, of course, there's the album by the Jefferson Airplane that's making a big hit, Long John Silver. If you haven't seen the album jacket, then it's something else. You actually kind of unfold the jacket, and then there's some instructions on how to put it back together again. It makes a cardboard stash box for dope, and you've got a lid in the top that says 9 fine grains of fragrant weed enclosed. On the album, there are songs like the Grace Slick song, a song that she wrote called "Son of Jesus." It says, Jesus had a son by Mary Magdalene. They had a daughter too, and God got off on the daughter and watched Jesus dance on the Sea of Galilee. Watch him dance, 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 dance. Or speaking of religion, we could not bypass that album that now has become the biggest money-making record in the history of phonograph records. And I obviously am talking about the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar. Who wrote Jesus Christ Superstar, they're both admitted atheists, and now that they're millionaires, they've got to be laughing all the way to the bank. About halfway through Superstar, you've got the scene between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And she sings, I don't know how to love him, he's just a man. And then she does this thing where she sings, sleep and I shall soothe you. Well, in the live production I saw, at that point, she gives Jesus this body rub down. Christ puts his arms around her, kisses her, screams, oh, it feels so nice. And some preachers managed to let that get played in their Sunday school classes. Of course, right at the end, naturally, I mean, if you're an atheist, you're not going to have a resurrection. And they deliberately left Jesus in the grave, but not before they put in a scene where Christ and the apostles are all looped in wine at the Last Supper. Of course, not only love and religion, but drugs too. Now, fortunately, there aren't as many drug songs around today as there were a few years ago. Now, back in the late 60s, you had things like Take a Journey to the Center of Your Mind, and White Rabbit, and 8 Miles High, and then along came Steppenwolf. And they did things like Take a Magic Carpet Ride, Don't Step on the Grass, Sam, and I'd rather not quote the words of the Pusher today. Some people say, oh man, don't you know there aren't any drug songs around anymore? Well, that's a bunch of baloney. All you got to do is pick one of the biggest albums in the country recently, Sticky Fingers by the Stones. We won't talk about the zipper in the front of the picture underneath. But, of course, the big top 40 song off there, was the big hit, Brown Sugar, How Come You Taste So Good, Girl? Of course, adults got all worried because they thought brown sugar was about sex. It isn't. It's cocaine. Also on that album, there was the song, Please, Sister Morphine, turn my nightmares into dreams. Sweet cousin cocaine, lay a cool hand on my head. And in the song Dead Flowers, Mick Jagger sings, I'll be in my basement room with a needle and a spoon. And on Exile on Main Street, they've got this song called Rip This Joint, which sort of paints a picture of President Nixon sitting back in his easy chair and rolling up a joint for the Stones. Speaking of drugs, we couldn't bypass the so-called Satan rock sounds of Black Sabbath. They've been known to hold black masses before their concerts. One of them, complete with a nude on the altar of a church that had been sprinkled with chicken blood, and then they had a mock human sacrifice. One of the members of the group claims to be the seventh son of the seventh son, which has real significance in witchcraft. They've had several million selling albums. One of them was a thing called Paranoid, had on a song called The Hand of Doom that said, first it was the bomb, Vietnam, Napalm, disillusioning, you push the needle in, colors in your mind, satisfying time. Then on Masters of Reality, the first cut in the album was entitled Sweet Leaf, which is Foliage Mom. And the next song was entitled After Forever. Sounds like a Jesus song. Man, the words sound like they're right out of a revival meeting. He says, don't you know Jesus is the only way to love? And you get it over to side 2, and they've got this thing called Lord of this World, Evil Possessor, in which the singer personifies himself as Satan. Of course, the big drug influence today really isn't the songs as much as it is the concerts, the fests, and the musicians. Let's face it, man, most of today's rock fest could better be called drug fest because the majority of the people there are bombed out of their mind and dope, and it isn't soft dope either. In the first place, the underworld is not stupid. They control the drug traffic in this country, and they know if you got 100,000 people all together in one place with immunity from arrest and the police promising they won't do one thing to anybody taking dope, they are obviously going to seize upon that opportunity as a ready-made consumer market to push dope. And the other thing they do, they know if they've got them there in one place, they can deliberately control the quality of the dope, they can pollute it to get the guys there hooked on to something a lot stronger later on. Now, you can say what you want to about whether or not the music, the entertainers, or whatever it is influences people to take drugs. All I know is that when the Stones were on tour recently, I saw them when they were out in Denver where we live. And the minute Jagger hit that stage singing Brown Sugar, man, in went the hands into the jeans and out came the little plastic bags of you know what in every color. And it was like passing the offering plate on Sunday morning. And one guy takes it here, passes it to the next guy, and he the next guy, and on down. Then it goes around the corner of the aisle, and up that aisle, on up the next aisle. Man, I mean, everybody was sharing everybody else's dope, and nobody knew what they were dropping, chewing, or snorting. And the hash pipes, and the pot pipes every which way. You didn't have your own, man. You never had it when you left. By the end of the concert, there were 15,000 zombie-like drug freaks stoned out of their minds, on their feet, dancing in one mass psychosexual drug freak orgy. Not only are the rock fests an influence? But the thing that really disturbs me most is the fact that it's the entertainers who are really having the biggest influence on the drug culture today. Now, let's be honest about it. Today, almost without exception, the heavy rock musicians use dope, they let it be known, and they glorify the fact. In fact, a couple years ago, they were going to send a hard rock group to Vietnam and replace Bob Hope and play for the troops. They had a little problem, though, because the State Department refused to give security clearance to any rock group that had somebody in the band who'd been busted for dope, and the promoters couldn't find a group that could qualify and get out of the country. If you were going to sit down and make a list of all the rock musicians who use dope, man, you'd be here the rest of the day. You could start back with the Beatles. Most of you know John Lennon is now admitted. They not only took pot and acid, but heroin too. In fact, he says he took over 1,000 acid trips, and he and George Harrison used to walk around just eating stuff like candy. A couple of years ago, Brian Jones of the Stones died in his own swimming pool as the indirect result of an overdose. And Al Wilson, the lead guitarist for the Can Heat, died of an OD. Even Creedence Clearwater Revival helped put on a concert to raise money for the escaped convict LSD priest Timothy Leary. Sly and the family were driving down the freeways of Los Angeles recently, and their mobile home got pulled over, and they found the thing was stashed full of dope. And the Jefferson Airplane, of course, you remember Grace Slick, a year or so ago, had that illegitimate baby by the lead guitarist of the group. You probably remember what she named the baby, God, small g. She said she wanted to be humble about it. While she was expecting the baby, they interviewed her. She said, we're a little worried about this kid because of the weird dope we take all the time. Then there was Steve Stills, picked up, and a hotel clerk turned him in. He was a little spaced out, crawling on his hands and knees down the corridor of a hotel, pursued by a couple of unclad young ladies. And Johnny Winter, the blues guitarist, who just recently got out of a mental institution where he's been trying to kick smack. And, of course, the Rolling Stones, when they did their recent tour, everywhere they went, on their lapels, they were sporting these big buttons that said Coke. And then at Jagger's birthday party at Madison Square Garden, for a birthday present, he got a silver-plated snuff box with cocaine. A couple of years ago in Canada, they arrested a rock guitarist on the charges of heroin possession. At his trial, man, he admitted he took everything from pot to acid to opium. In fact, he said the new direction in his music was going to be called sweet opium music. Well, he never got a chance to try it out. In fact, at the trial, he made an ironic statement. Man, he said, I'll probably get busted for dope at my own funeral. Well, not quite. It's a terrible tragedy that the highest paid entertainer in all of history, twice commanding over $100,000 a night, and having everything in material possessions this world has to offer, was so mixed up in his own head he couldn't even find a few minutes worth of sleep without knocking himself out with pills until he did it one time too many and was found dead, face down, suffocated in his own vomit from an overdose. Hendrix. A couple of years ago, they asked a rock singer the question, what's your philosophy of life? She said, my advice to the youth of America, stay stoned to dope and have a good time. The pictures they show you of Janice, she's always smiling and carefree. They'll never show you a picture of the way Janice looked when they found her. Man, they don't want you to see that side of the dope scene. A friend of mine was there when they walked into the hotel room. Her face was a mat of flesh and blood. She hit the nightstand as she rolled off the bed and bashed her face in. It wasn't in the waste paper can in the corner. The hypodermic syringe, still half full of junk, was hanging out of her arm. When they pried open her fingers, so help me, in her hand, she was still clutching the change of the dealer who had sold her the junk. If you say anything against the Vietnam War, you can get a lot of people to go along with you. And I agree, man, it is a terrible tragedy that we've lost 50,000 young men in Vietnam in the last 5 years. You also know, according to the official estimates published in a national periodical, not over there, man, right here in this country in the last 5 years, 150,000 young people have died directly and indirectly from taking hard drugs. And how many of you have demonstrated against that recently? I want to pose you an honest question today. What about the rock entertainers who take dope? Let's face it, some of these guys are idolized by millions of young people, especially some of the impressionable younger teens. They use dope, they get up at their concerts, they'll brag about what a groovy thing it is to play while you're high, talk casually, tell the audience all to get stoned. Then when they do get busted, They thumb their nose at the police, and of course the underground press and the rock magazines hold them up to be a martyr and some kind of a countercultural hero. You can agree or disagree, but I personally believe that some of these musicians are the accomplices in the murder of thousands of kids across this country, especially some impressionable younger teens who may be first turned on with dope because they were partially influenced by the image of the favorite rock star who said, man, doing dope is a really groovy thing. Well, the drug scene in rock is an awful lot different than when rock started, I'll grant you that. You know, back in the middle 50s, Elvis Presley came along saying, you ain't nothing but a hound dog. And later, you know, you had the Beatles, but your teachers, they didn't pay much attention. When rock first came along, and Mr. Marcus said to Miss Faulkner, now, if we hang on long enough, good old Bing Crosby will be back again. But in spite of the little help that Mr. Marcus and Miss Faulkner got from their musical favorite, Lawrence Welk, things haven't changed too much. Rock is still here today, and in fact, rock is the major form of communication among the youth of the world. In fact, there have been several psychosociological studies concluded, and in their findings, these educational institutions discovered that the rock entertainers of today are a reference point for the moral values of the majority of young people in this country. Well, when you talk about rock, of course, you can mean lots of things because there are many different kinds. Country rock, folk rock, jazz rock, big band rock, nostalgia rock, and of course acid rock, strobes, light shows, the whole bit. It really hit its peak about 2-3 years ago. It's still around today, although it's not quite as popular as it was then. It's music, you know, designed to simulate an hallucinogenic state of mind. In fact, I've got some friends of mine, some buddies of mine, who have now turned off rock and pot and turned on to God, who, when they get into the right type of room, and I watched them, man, nothing but the music. They could flash back to former trips, sometimes completely hallucinate, so that literally it becomes a way to blow your mind in music. A moment ago, I mentioned that music is a powerful influence, but you know, with music today, you literally influence the whole country. Think about this for a second. Every time you buy a record, it's like a vote. You know, when you buy that record, with your money, you support and promote the message and the lifestyle of that entertainer. Now, just because you buy the record does not mean you agree with everything he does. It just means at the consumer market basis, financially, your money goes to support and promote that lifestyle and his personal views. And in this way, you cast a vote. And frankly, I've been disturbed at the way some young people in America have been voting in the last couple of years. For example, The Stones, as you know, just recently toured Canada and America. They were here a couple of years ago, too. At that time, they had an album on the charts called Beggar's Banquet. One of the big songs off that album that they did on this tour. It's called Street Fighting Man. When summertime comes, it's right for fighting in the streets. Boy, it's time for a revolution. Well, some of you know. The last time they were here in Altamont, California, they got their own revolution. 300,000 kids showed up for a rock concert. They brought in the Hells Angels, that devised the Grateful Dead, gave them $500 worth of free booze, slipped them some acid, got them high, then said, "Be our bodyguards." Well, as some of you know, Mick Jagger walked on the stage to sing "Sympathy for the Devil," a Stone song that has become an anthem for Satanists in this country. And at the foot of the stage, the Hells Angels knifed to death a black teenager while the Stones stood and watched it, murdered 3 other kids, then took steel-tip pool cues, ran through the crowd, clubbing and bashing people senseless. One Hells Angel was finally arrested, but he couldn't be convicted. Nobody would witness against him. And the Stones, who had watched the whole thing, not only refused to be witnesses, they didn't even have the courtesy to come to the trial. In fact, they had a camera crew filming the murder scene. You know what they did? They made a movie called Give Me Shelter, made a mint off of it, never gave a dime to the parents of any of the kids who were killed, and to that black teenager's parents who was murdered at the foot of the stage, they couldn't even so much as send a note of sympathy. But apparently, the youth of America could care less because the Stones came back again. You know, in less than a month's time, they packed them out wherever they went and made $5 million, still their pockets full of gold, and headed back for the French Riviera. It was a couple of years ago, the Jefferson Airplane did an album called Volunteers. The title song said, "Come on, you volunteers of America, you've got to revolution. We are the forces of chaos and anarchy." If you think they're kidding, they aren't. A while back, Grace Slick was accidentally invited to a party at the White House. Now, she couldn't get in because she tried to go there with Abby Hoffman. They weren't going to let that guy in the White House. But she admitted later she'd gone there with 600 mics of acid in her pockets. Her plans were to go into the party, put the acid into the tea to sabotage the United States government, freak out President Nixon. About 3 years ago, the Doors were down in Miami, Florida. 14,000 kids showed up for a concert, average age 12, 13, 14. Now, some of you remember what happened. In the middle of the concert, Jim Morrison took off his clothes and with other males engaged in forms of sex perversion on stage. And a couple of weeks later, they were arrested again on the charges of assaulting an airline stewardess and trying to hijack an airplane. Well, when it happened, I said to myself, man, what will the youth of America do? Well, in the next 2 years, they put out 5 albums. Every one of them earned a gold record. In fact, the last album Jim Morrison ever recorded with the Doors was entitled L.A. Woman. You saw it advertised. You saw those pictures with a nude woman crucified on a telephone pole. And one of the last songs Morrison ever performed was a song that he wrote. The last line he screamed to the rafters, "Cancel my subscription to the resurrection." Well, the Bible says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked." And I don't know, but maybe God took him up on it, because tragically, a year ago, July 3, they found Mr. Morrison's body floating in a bathtub in a hotel room in Paris, France. He'd been buried 6 days before the press was notified. There was no autopsy performed. The woman he was sleeping with got all $6 million of his estate. They said it was a heart attack, but nobody is really absolutely for sure exactly what may or may not have happened. It's been a couple of years ago since John Lennon got a gold record for a song called "Power to the People." And the first verse said, "You say you want a revolution? Well, you better get on right away to the streets." And more recently, Lennon had the hit "Imagine." Imagine there's no heaven, no hell, no religion, no countries, no possessions. You know where they live like that? Under dialectical materialism, better known in the vernacular as Marxism. I say, you don't think he's a communist or something, do you? Recently, John Lennon put up all the money to produce a film that's a propaganda tool for the Irish Republican Army. If you know your politics, that's the bombing organization that are blowing up buildings and killing people in Northern Ireland right now. And in fact, more recently, Lennon put up all the money to produce the David Peel album entitled "The Pope Smokes Dope, God Gave Him the Grass." Of course, while we're talking about objectionable votes that young people cast, I mean, we couldn't let the morning go by without considering Alice Cooper now, could we? Coming on stage with dresses, high-heeled shoes, a mascara, fingernail polish, lipstick, teachers, they all happen to be fellas. Off of the album Killer, they do this song called "Dead Babies," and Alice brings out this lifelike-looking doll with blood capsules attached to it, takes a hatchet, chops it to pieces, blood spurts everywhere, gleefully throws the appendages into the audience to all the animals sitting out there. Then he gets on the floor, makes love to a 6-foot live boa constrictor, gets back up, climbs on a gallows they've erected, hangs himself, the lights go black, and then what Superstar didn't do, Alice does, comes back resurrected from the dead. Now, I've raised the issue of some groups and the dope revolution and some pretty freaky things because I'd like to ask you a couple of serious questions. Did you ever stop and think about who gets your money when you buy a record, no matter why you buy it, what you're helping to support and promote as an image in your society? You say, man, we're not influenced by that, but the advertising industry spends billions of dollars every year in one single idea. Tell enough people something enough times, show enough people something enough times, and somebody is going to be influenced by it. And when you buy a record, you are helping to support and promote that lifestyle and that person as a moral image projected before society today. Now, you may agree, or you may disagree with some of the issues I've raised, but I've tried to deliberately provoke your thinking about the influence of some of today's entertainers. I've had the privilege of being interviewed in some of the top rock stations in America. In fact, recently, I was flown to New York, was interviewed in the top underground station in metropolitan New York, and it was broadcast nationwide over the ABC network. A week before I was on, they had on John Lennon. The week after was Frank Zappa, and got me in between those two guys. For 3.5 hours, I spoke about my personal faith in God and as well about the drug scene in rock. Well, one of these interviews recently, over the air, the program station manager said, man, we choose very, very carefully the records we play. I said, don't give me that kind of hype. Less than 5 minutes before I walked in here, your station played a record that openly glorifies acid. Well, he said, look, man, we play what's popular. I said, what about the message in the song? He said, look, I could care less whether a song's about dope. He says, I don't even care if a group wants to promote dope and glorify it. If that's the kind of groups the kids are going to support, if that's the kind of records they're going to buy, I could care less. I'm going to play what the kids buy. But he said, I'll tell you something. He said, Mr. Larson, if we had 3 teenagers call this station to disapprove of playing the records of a rock group that glorifies dope, he said we would take their records off the air and we would never play them again. But he said, you know what the problem is? He said, thousands of kids call us and tell us what they want to hear, but we have never had a teenager call this station to disapprove of a record or to disapprove of playing the records of a rock group that takes dope. Well, as young people, you've got the future of this country in your hands, and that future is going to be influenced with music. Now, if that's good or bad, that's up to you. But, let's be honest about a couple of things. First of all, for the most part, your parents don't have the faintest idea of what's being said in rock music. And some of you can just imagine look on Mom's face if she ever once heard Country Joe doing the fish cheer. You know what's going on. Furthermore, you're the ones who go to the concerts. You're the ones who buy the records. You're the people who support today's music scene. If you really think it's something to clap about, you really think it's something so funny, ask yourself if it's really people like Alice Cooper who represent the youth of America. Because if they do, man, you've got to be more warped than he is. I think it's fortunate, personally, that you have got a choice today. A few years ago, you didn't have so much of a choice. But today, in the pop music scene, there are some songs that speak meaningfully about love, songs that speak about a desire for peace in the world, and some that even speak about a personal faith in God. But at the same time, you can walk into any record store in this city, and you can buy the records to financially support some groups who take a permissive attitude towards sexual fornication, dope, and some of them even revolution. But it's a choice you alone make. And when you walk in a record store, it's a choice nobody's going to make for you. I'm here today because I'd like to think that there are some of you out there who will honestly stop and think for a second and consider that choice a little more carefully as a result of this program this morning. And secondly, I'm here today not because I'm anti-dope or anti-rock or anything of the nature. I'm here today basically because I am pro-Jesus. Because a few years ago, I had a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. He completely changed my life and absolutely turned my head around about the drug scene in rock music. And I'm concerned about going to young people in this country and saying, wake up. there is reality in a personal faith in Jesus Christ, and only with the faith in God will you possess the moral ability to take a stand against the dope culture in this hour. And if you don't have that faith, you're going to swim downstream with the rest of the drug-oriented fish. I encourage you, as young people in this country concerned about where our nation is headed, to stop and think for a moment. You may agree, you may disagree with the issues I've raised today, but I have honestly wanted to provoke you to think more seriously about the influence of today's songs and today's singers. You may agree, or you may disagree, but I've only been here to share with you my feelings, and I hope that as a result of it, you'll be better prepared to face tomorrow, and you'll be in a better position to evaluate the culture in which you live. Thanks a lot for taking time to listen, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.